The auctioneer laughed when Caleb Turner raised his hand. $20,000? He looked around the room. Nobody else moved. $20,000 for the entire farm? A few men near the back started laughing. One of them shook his head and muttered, "That boy doesn't know what he's doing." Caleb heard them. He didn't care, because while everyone else was looking at the cracked fields, the collapsing barn, and the weeds swallowing the property, Caleb was looking at something else. An old red tractor. It had been sitting beneath a half-collapsed shed for nearly 20 years. Its paint was faded. Its tires were flat. Rust covered the hood. Most people wouldn't have called it a tractor anymore. They would have called it scrap metal. But Caleb was a mechanic, and from the moment he saw it, something bothered him. The engine didn't look completely dead. And if he was right, that forgotten tractor might be worth more than anyone at the auction realized. What Caleb didn't know was that the tractor would eventually lead him to a secret buried beneath the farm, one that could completely change the way he saw the land. Caleb was only 27 years old when he bought the 160-acre property in rural Texas. He had spent most of his life fixing machines, pickup trucks, combine harvesters, old tractors, anything with an engine that other people had given up on. But farming? That was different. Caleb had never owned a farm. He had never raised cattle, and he had never successfully grown a commercial crop. Still, the property had caught his attention. It had been abandoned for years. The farmhouse needed serious repairs. The fences were broken. The barn roof had partially collapsed. The pasture was brown and almost completely bare. And the soil looked hard enough to break a shovel. Local farmers had already written the place off. One man told Caleb that nothing worthwhile had grown there in years. Another called it the worst piece of farmland in the county. Caleb bought it anyway. As he drove away from the auction, an older farmer named Earl Simmons stopped him. Earl had farmed in the area for more than 40 years. He looked at Caleb and said, "You're going to regret this." Caleb smiled. "Maybe." Earl pointed toward the property. "That land doesn't hold water." Caleb looked back at the fields. "Then I'll figure out why." Earl laughed. But Caleb wasn't joking. For the first month, Caleb didn't plant anything. Instead, he walked. Every morning, he crossed the property with a notebook. He studied the fences, checked the pasture, dug small holes in different sections. He wanted to understand the land before spending money on it. And the results were worse than he expected. The soil was heavily compacted. The top layer was thin. When Caleb poured water onto several patches, it disappeared almost immediately through cracks. But then he noticed something strange. Near the northern pasture, a small patch of weeds was greener than everything around it. Caleb crouched down. The ground felt cooler. He dug his fingers into the soil. It was darker, moist. That shouldn't have been possible. Not in the middle of a property this dry. Caleb marked the location. Then he went back to the old shed. The tractor was still there. He spent several days clearing debris away from it. The machine was an old International tractor from the 1950s. Its fuel system was clogged. The ignition was damaged. The battery was useless. But the engine wasn't seized. Caleb smiled. "Let's see what you've got." He cleaned the fuel lines, changed the oil, rebuilt the ignition, replaced several hoses. Then came the moment he had been waiting for. Caleb climbed into the seat. He turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. The engine coughed, then died. Caleb waited. He tried one more time. The old tractor suddenly roared to life. Smoke poured from the exhaust. The machine shook violently, but it was running. Caleb jumped down and laughed. For the first time since buying the farm, something had gone right. But the tractor was about to tell him something he wasn't expecting. The next morning, Caleb attached an old disc harrow to the tractor. He drove toward the driest field. The machine struggled almost immediately. The ground was incredibly hard. Caleb slowed down and let the tractor work. Then, about 30 yards into the field, The machine suddenly dropped several inches. Caleb stopped. He climbed down. The soil beneath the tractor was different. Darker, looser, and moist. He dug deeper. The moisture continued. Caleb followed the line across the field. It seemed to lead toward the same green patch he'd noticed earlier. That evening, he searched through old papers left inside the farmhouse. Most were useless. Tax records, repair receipts, old bills. Then he found a handwritten farming notebook. It belonged to one of the previous owners. Caleb flipped through the pages. Most contained ordinary notes about crops and livestock. Then one sentence stopped him. It had been written decades earlier. And underneath it, someone had drawn a line twice. Never plow too deep near the north pasture. Caleb stared at the words. Why? What was beneath that field? He grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The sun had already disappeared. He walked toward the north pasture, and within minutes, the old tractor's tire tracks led him directly to the green patch. Caleb began digging. A few inches down, his shovel struck something hard. Metal. He cleared away the dirt. It was an old iron valve, and it was connected to a pipe disappearing beneath the field. Caleb stood up slowly. For years, everyone had believed the farm was dry. But now he was standing over something that suggested the opposite. There was water underneath this land. The only question was, how much? And why had nobody found it before? The next morning, Caleb returned to the north pasture before sunrise. The old iron valve was still there. For years, it had been buried beneath the ground, hidden from everyone who had walked across the property. But Caleb couldn't stop thinking about it. If one abandoned valve was still connected to a water line, there had to be more. He grabbed his shovel and followed the pipe. It disappeared beneath the soil, then surfaced again several yards away. Caleb kept digging. Then he found another valve, and another. The deeper he went, the more certain he became that this wasn't some random piece of old farm equipment. It was a system. But who had built it? And why had it been abandoned? By late morning, Caleb followed the line to a section of the property almost completely covered by weeds. He cleared the vegetation, then stopped. Hidden beneath the brush was an old stone structure, an old spring house. Caleb forced the swollen wooden door open. Inside was a collection basin. He shined his flashlight into it. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed a faint reflection. Water. Clear water. Caleb crouched down. He touched it with his fingers. Cold. Very cold. He stared at the spring for several seconds. The farm everyone had called hopeless wasn't actually dry. It had a water source beneath it. But there was a problem. The old system had been abandoned for decades. The pipes were clogged. The channels were filled with dirt, and whatever had once carried the water toward the fields had almost completely disappeared. Caleb suddenly understood the warning in the old notebook. Never plow too deep near the north pasture. The previous farmer hadn't been warning people about bad soil. He had been warning them about the old water system. And then Caleb looked back toward the shed, toward the old tractor. Suddenly, its presence on the property made perfect sense. The tractor wasn't just an old farming machine. It had probably been used to maintain the channels that carried water across the farm. And Caleb realized he had exactly what he needed to rebuild them, the old machine. For the next several weeks, the tractor worked from sunrise until sunset. Caleb cleared years of accumulated debris. He reopened the old channels. He broke through compacted soil. He repaired sections of the irrigation system. And slowly, the farm began changing. But there was still a problem. Finding water was one thing. Getting the land to hold it was another. Caleb started changing the way he treated the soil. He planted cover crops, restored damaged pasture, reduced unnecessary tilling, and divided sections of the farm so the grass could recover between grazing periods. His neighbors still weren't convinced. One afternoon, Earl Simmons drove up beside the fence. He looked at the fields, then at Caleb. "You're putting a lot of work into a farm that doesn't want to grow." Caleb smiled. "Maybe the farm isn't the problem." Earl frowned. "What do you mean?" Caleb pointed toward the soil. "Maybe we just haven't been treating it right." Earl shook his head. "Good luck." Then he drove away. Caleb watched him disappear down the road. He knew the old farmer wasn't convinced. But Caleb wasn't trying to convince Earl. He was trying to prove something to himself. And there was only one way to do it. He had to plant. Caleb chose one field for his first serious test. It wasn't large. He couldn't afford to risk the entire farm. If the experiment failed, at least he wouldn't lose everything. He prepared the soil, planted the crop, and waited. For several weeks, nothing unusual happened. Then the plants began emerging, green, healthy, stronger than Caleb expected. But the real test was still coming. Summer, Texas summer. By July, the temperatures became brutal. The surrounding fields began turning brown. Grass disappeared from exposed areas. Some farmers started buying additional feed for their livestock. Others simply watched their fields deteriorate. Caleb's farm wasn't immune to the heat, but something was different. When he pushed his hand into the soil, he could still feel moisture beneath the surface. The cover crops had helped. The restored channels had helped. The spring had helped. And the soil was finally beginning to behave like living soil instead of dust. Then the weather forecast changed. A heat wave was coming. 3 days, possibly 4, temperatures higher than normal. Caleb stood in the middle of his field that evening. He knew this was the moment everything would either come together or fall apart. The next morning, the heat arrived. By noon, the air felt heavy. By afternoon, the plants began showing stress. Caleb drove through the rows on the old tractor. He checked everything: the water channels, the soil, the plants. Then he noticed something. The northern section was holding moisture better than the rest. The same area connected to the old spring. Caleb smiled. The system was working, but he still needed to know whether the crop would survive. The following morning, Earl Simmons arrived. He had heard that Caleb's crop was still green. Earl stepped out of his pickup and walked toward the field. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared. Beyond Caleb's fence, the land was brown. Inside it, the crop was still green. Earl finally looked at Caleb. "How are you doing this?" Caleb pointed toward the ground. "We're not fighting the weather." Earl looked confused. "We're keeping the water where it falls." Earl looked back at the field. For the first time, the old farmer seemed to understand. Caleb hadn't discovered a miracle. He had discovered an old system that had been forgotten. Word spread through the town. People who had laughed at Caleb's purchase began visiting the farm. Some wanted to see the spring. Others wanted to inspect the soil. A few simply wanted to understand how the worst farm in the county had suddenly become one of the greenest. Caleb showed them everything. He didn't hide the process. He explained the water channels, the soil management, the pasture rotation, and the old tractor. One visitor asked him why he had bothered repairing a machine that looked like it belonged in a museum. Caleb looked at the tractor. Because it still worked. That simple answer became almost symbolic. The farm had still worked too. It just needed someone willing to repair what had been neglected. Then came harvest. Caleb had deliberately kept his expectations low. He didn't know exactly how much the field would produce. But when the first results came in, he couldn't believe the numbers. The yield was significantly better than Caleb had expected. It wasn't a miracle harvest. It wasn't the biggest harvest in Texas, but for a farm everyone had declared worthless, it was extraordinary. Caleb stood beside the field that evening. 1 year earlier, the same land had been cracked, brown, and abandoned. Now it was producing again. And then something happened that Caleb hadn't expected. The auctioneer who had sold him the property arrived at the farm. The same man who had laughed when Caleb bid $20,000. He walked slowly through the property. He looked at the restored barn, the green pasture, the crop. Then he saw the old tractor. He walked around it, ran his hand across the faded red hood. "I remember this thing," he said. Caleb smiled. "I figured you did." The auctioneer shook his head. "I thought it was junk." Caleb climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The old engine fired immediately. Its deep mechanical rumble rolled across the fields. The auctioneer smiled. "Guess I was wrong." Caleb looked across the farm. So was everybody else. But Caleb knew the tractor hadn't actually changed everything. Not by itself. The tractor had only given him the ability to uncover what had already been there. The water. the old channels, the soil, the potential. The farm hadn't needed someone to completely reinvent it. It needed someone to pay attention. And that became the lesson Caleb carried with him. When people saw cracked soil, he saw a problem that could be solved. When they saw a broken tractor, he saw an engine that might still run. When they saw an abandoned farm, he saw a system that had been neglected, and when everyone told him he had made the worst decision of his life, he decided to find out for himself. 1 year after the auction, the farm that nobody wanted was producing again. The old barn had been repaired, the pasture was green, the spring was flowing, and the tractor that had been sitting under a collapsed shed for nearly 20 years was still working. Every morning, Caleb would start it and drive across the same land everyone had once called worthless. And perhaps the strangest part was this. The farm wasn't valuable because Caleb had found some hidden treasure. It was valuable because the treasure had been there all along. It had simply been buried beneath neglect. Sometimes, the biggest mistake people make isn't buying the wrong land. It's assuming that land has nothing left to give. Caleb Turner had been laughed at for spending $20,000 on the worst farm in Texas. 1 year later, people were coming to him for advice. And the old tractor? It never became valuable because it was old. It became valuable because someone believed it was worth fixing. And maybe that's why Caleb kept it. Because every time he started that engine, he was reminded of the lesson that changed his life. Don't judge something by the condition you found it in. Sometimes, broken isn't finished. Sometimes, forgotten isn't worthless. And sometimes, the thing everyone else abandoned is exactly where the opportunity is hiding. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to MacPence Farm Stories for more incredible American farm stories, forgotten land discoveries, unlikely farmers, and transformations that prove that sometimes the impossible is only something nobody has tried hard enough to fix.